All right, so welcome back to painting class. So far in class, we have been working on showing the concept of creating the illusion of space on a flat surface as we've been painting our landscapes. And we use the concepts of aerial and atmospheric perspective to have things be lighter and grayer at the back and gradually move towards us with more brilliant color and more detail so that we have the effect that we can step into this landscape and walk inside. So we've been working with the illusion of depth or the illusion of space on kind of a broad scale or a bigger scale in a landscape. We're gonna shift gears now in two ways. In one way, we're going to shift gears and we're going to be showing space to make the illusion of three-dimensional objects. So we're going to learn how to use paint to create this illusion that this object has form or three-dimensional quality. In order to make that happen, we're going to review the concept of value using watercolor. Also, in order to make that happen, we are going to be painting with a little bit different painting technique that allows us to more greatly control the paint. So when we've been painting landscapes, we have done a lot of wet into wet color mixing, and we've done a lot of just kind of quick painting, letting it dry, going back and adding details. And today we're going to learn a new skill where we use very little water and we move paint on the sheet instead of add paint. So today we're going to start first with our value scale, and we're going to create a value scale that has a gradual transition from dark to light, like this example here. So I'm going to show you how to do that. You may choose whatever color you like for this activity. I would avoid yellow. We've talked about yellow and avoiding yellow before. Yellow is a hard color to lighten. I'm going to use my CAD red, or this orangey red, and I'm just going to mix it up. I don't have a lot of space on my palette, so I'm going to mix it up over here. Now I'm aiming to have this orangey red be right here in the middle, just like when we made our value scales before. But for this painting activity, I like to start first dark. So I'm going to add black to my paint until it's fairly dark. So you can see I've got it mixed up there and it is quite dark. I'm actually gonna shift my paper so that it's going side to side. And you can see that I'm going to start first with my dark color. And I'm going to do a couple of stripes. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to clean my paintbrush out and I'm going to grab a little bit more of this orange and add it to my paint so that my paint starts to lighten up. I'm going to do the same thing again, making sure to squeeze my paintbrush dry in between. So as I'm gradually adding paint, you can see that my paint is getting lighter. I'm aiming to have the clean paint be here, so I can go ahead and add more of that color. And now what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna clean my paintbrush off, and I'm going to go with just clean paint here, and I'm going to put that here in the middle. And I'm gonna blend now this direction. So I'm blending on my paper and allowing that paint to kind of mix together so that I have this gradual shift from dark to light. Now I have a puddle here that I don't know that you can see that I want to get rid of. And so I just cleaned my paintbrush out and squeezed it dry, and I'm just gonna really softly try to squeeze up some of that paint, just so that my puddle doesn't. What will happen is it'll just scoot back up as the paint dries and make a bloom in the paint. So I have from dark to my color, And now I'm gonna do the same thing, but I'm just gonna let my paint run out. So I am going to just let the water take over. Now you'll see I don't have a lot of water, and now I just clean my paintbrush out. I'm gonna squeeze it dry, and I'm just gonna blend this direction. Might need just a little bit darker paint. I'm gonna just pull some of that down further. I'm gonna clean my paintbrush out again, squeeze it dry, and pull those lighter values down this way. So it's more about blending on your paper, right? And less about blending on your palette. But I have this gradual shift from dark to light. Whoops, too much paint in my paintbrush. And I have now a value scale for reference. So this is practice skill number 1. Practice skill number 2, we're gonna use this idea of a value scale from dark to light to replicate some of our basic forms in paint. So here's my value scale in paint compared to this value scale on the paper. And I can look and I can see or find these grays out here in my image. And the goal is to be able to create that sensation of three-dimensional space on my sheet. So if we look at just the image and then this illustration, we can see how we can imagine those kind of bands of value wrapping their way around the sphere. We are going to create that effect by doing something called underpainting using watercolor. The art term for this is called grisaille. So what I'm gonna do is just draw some of my basic like geometric forms on here. We're gonna do one each of all 4 of these. The reason for that is if we learn how to create shadows on those 4 basic shapes, we end up with the knowledge we need to draw or paint almost anything. And so that is why we're always practicing those forms. Now, the cube can be kind of tricky to draw. I'm going to show you a trick. I'm going to draw a square, and then I'm going to draw another square lightly behind the first square, and then I'm going to connect these corners. And ta-da, I have a cube, and I'm just going to add my shadow on over there. Ta-da! Okay, so underpainting. I am going to start painting with my sphere, and I'm going to be using just black. I'll leave this here for reference. So I'm just going to be using the Payne's Gray, which we are calling black. So I'm going to just grab a little pile of paint, not too much water, mostly paint. And what I'm going to do is, this is opposite what I'm painting, but is put the shadow on where it would be darkest. So I'm just looking at like this shadow stripe on the image. And that's all I'm going to put on using paint. So remember, we're learning a new technique today that builds off this technique of blending on the paper. So you can see I have my darkest like section or little thin moon on my sphere. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my paintbrush and clean it out. So I'm cleaning it out. I have a clean paintbrush, and I'm gonna squeeze it dry. This is the important step. I need to squeeze it dry. I don't want water in my paintbrush. I'm now gonna take my paintbrush and use it a little bit like it's a pencil to pull this paint up onto the surface of this sphere, like making the next couple of moons worth of values. So it should be a little lighter than this dark stripe at the bottom. And now I'm going to stop again. So I have dark and I have dark middle. I just clean my paintbrush out again. I'm gonna squeeze my paintbrush dry again. And now I am continuing to pull this color up and onto the surface of the sphere. And I'm watching for a couple of things to happen. One, if I have too much water, I want to go ahead and make sure that I'm squeezing my paintbrush dry again. Two, what I'm also watching is I want there to be no stripes. So I'm kind of trying to blend so that there's a gradual transition from the dark to the light. And now I'm also watching for it to get too dark. So once I see that it's getting dark, I'm going back to my water, I'm cleaning my paintbrush off, and I'm squeezing it dry again. So we're working with very little water to control the paint. Cleaned my paintbrush out again to pull this last little section of lights up. And so we are using that, and now I'm just gonna like soften that stripe again. So I'm trying not to have there be a hard line between where it's darker and where it's lighter. I want it to be more gradual. And ta-da, you can see I used just that one stripe of paint. Everything else was just me moving the paint, and I can do my last step here now, and I can add my shadow under my sphere. I can soften that shadow now as it moves away from the sphere. I just cleaned my paintbrush out, squeezed it dry, and I'm just gonna pull that shadow longer, but have it get lighter. Just kind of normal for shadows. So you can see my sphere looks reasonably three-dimensional, and all I did was use black. Once this dries, I can have my sphere become this other color, the color that I used for practice, which is why we call it underpainting, because I'm going to paint the color over the color that I just applied to the sheet. But it does have to dry completely first. The other shapes are the same process. The shadows just follow, we say that value follows form in art. And so the same thing is gonna happen. I'm going to add my darkest shadow using my Payne's Gray or my black. So you can see that that matches this section here. I'm now going to clean my paintbrush out, and I'm going to squeeze my paintbrush dry, and I'm going to gradually pull this value out into my sheet. And as soon as I see that I'm moving more paint than I want to move, right? So I'm moving past where I want this dark color. I want it to lighten up again. I am cleaning my paintbrush out again, squeezing it dry. I don't want to do this with a wet paintbrush. A wet paintbrush causes the paint to move too far, too fast. So I want to make sure that I'm using a paintbrush that's been squeezed dry. gonna squeeze my paintbrush dry again and come back, and I wanna smooth that transition. I don't wanna stripe. I want it to gradually shift from dark to light. And now I'll clean my paintbrush again, squeeze it dry, and this will be the final phase of just softening a little bit of that gray out this direction. Again, this will have to dry before we add our color, but I can come back and add my shadow, my cast shadow. Cleaned my paintbrush out again, squeezed it dry again, and now I'm pulling it to make that cast shadow effect. The only shape that is different is the cube. The cube, we have to paint one side at a time and allow it to dry in between. So I'm gonna just start here on the dark side of the cube, and I'll paint the entire dark portion of the cube. And that is the side that's here with the cast shadow. So if I want, I can go ahead and paint the shadow at the same time. If that means that that bottom edge of my cube disappears, that's fine. We call that a lost edge in art, and that happens fairly often. So it's not wrong to have that happen. And I have to let this dry until I move to the next side, because what I want to do is keep these edges nice and straight. And so if I paint the next side, it's just gonna leak because the paint is wet. But the overall effect is going to be that this side is dark, this side is medium, and the top is light. See if I can show you a finished cube on the backhand side here. So there you go. But I do have to wait for this guy to dry before I can make that happen. So go ahead and practice this technique of manipulating paint on your paper using very little water and a squeezed dry paintbrush to create values. If you don't get it at first, don't worry. It is a brand new skill, and you might have to practice more than once, and that is totally normal. So remember that this is practice, and we're learning something fresh and new. So don't panic if it doesn't turn out quite right the first time you do it. I have had a lot of practice, so I can do this fairly quickly, but it is just because I have worked with the technique and have perfected it a bit, so it comes fairly natural. So I want you to go ahead and shade or create the sensation of value using this dry controlled brush technique today until you have all four that look three-dimensional.